Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining A4LI for this policy discussion event. I'm excited about the conversation we have planned with Tom over the next hour, and I'm glad all of you attendees can make it. The way this event will work is that we will interview Tom for about 40 minutes, and then the last 20 minutes will be a Q&A session. So please send your questions directly to me in the chat, and I will ask them to Tom at the end. Now for introductions, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dylan Livingston, and I'm the founder and president of A4LI. I want to introduce Brianna Deutsch, A4LI's VP of Political Affairs and my fellow co-host for this event. A brief background on Brianna prior to this role. She worked in congressional offices in the US Senate and the US House, as well as a think tank in Washington, DC. In October of 2020, Brianna published Finding the Fountain: Why Government Must Unlock Biotech's Potential to Maximize Longevity, in an effort to inform Washington, DC influencers about the importance of aging research. Brianna will be joining us this afternoon from the UK, where she is currently studying public policy at the University of Cambridge. Brianna, can you say hello, introduce Tom, and then take us away from there?
Great, thanks, Dylan. As Dylan said, I'm Brianna, and I'm A4LI's VP of Political Affairs, and I'm very excited to be co-hosting this event this evening, or evening my time here in the UK. And I'm even more excited to introduce our wonderful guest today, Tom Kalil. Tom is currently Chief Innovation Officer at Schmidt Futures. Prior to Schmidt Futures, Tom served in the White House under both Presidents Obama and Clinton, where he helped design and launch national science and technology initiatives in areas such as nanotechnology, robotics, commercial space, STEM education, and others. He was also involved in launching the Obama administration's BRAIN initiative. Between administrations, Tom was special assistant to the Chancellor for Science and Technology at UC Berkeley, where he launched a program called Big Ideas at Berkeley, which provides grants to student-led teams committed to solving important problems both at home and abroad. And among many other roles, Tom also served as chair of the Global Health Working Group for the Clinton Global Initiative, where he developed new public and private sector initiatives in areas such as maternal and child health, undernutrition, and vaccines. So Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, delighted to be here.
Great. Well, I'm always interested to hear how people first became interested in the longevity space. So can you tell us a little bit about how you first came across this industry and why it captured your attention?
Yeah, so I had been hearing about the idea of increasing health span and delaying the onset of multiple chronic diseases, and this idea of the geoscience hypothesis, which is that there are these underlying molecular and other biological mechanisms that are responsible for aging, and that we were increasing our understanding about these mechanisms, but also how we might intervene in them as a way of increasing health span. And then I think the thing that got me most excited was learning that there was a really robust research agenda that was beginning to form around these issues, and that the NIH had created something called the Geoscience Network, and that there were researchers in many of our top institutions that were convinced that this was a good idea. And that started to happen around, I would say, 2012 and 2013, when I began to interact with some of the leaders of the geoscience community, like Jim Kirkland at Mayo, with a number of his colleagues in Mayo, did some of the early work in developing senolytics, that is, therapies that were designed to address cellular senescence.
So going now and talking a little bit more about your background in policy, you've been described as a policy entrepreneur. So what exactly does it mean to be a policy entrepreneur? And how can people who are policy entrepreneurs like yourself help move the longevity field forward?
Yeah, so the policy entrepreneurship is a concept in political science. And what they observe is when you ask, why does anything happen in the world of public policy? It's because usually there is a individual, or more likely, a relatively small team who is in a position to not only have an idea or learn about an idea, but then to actually move it forward. So if you say like, why did that happen? It's usually because there are both people who are generating those ideas and saying, for example, here's where we are today, here's where we'd like to be over the short, medium, and long term, and here's how we're going to get there. And then people who are in a position to help move that idea forward. So maybe it would be good to give a concrete example. So one of the things that I worked on for President Obama was the idea of grand challenges or 21st century moonshots. And one of the questions that I used to ask the research community was, in the same way that President Kennedy said, let's put astronauts on the moon and have them safely return by the end of the decade, what are the similarly important goals that we should be setting in the 21st century? And a group of researchers said, we believe that the time is right to do for neuroscience what the Human Genome Project did for genetics. That is to, in the same way that with the human genome, we drove down the cost of being able to sequence the entire human genome from $100 million to $1,000. What's an investment that we could make that would have a similarly transformative impact on our ability to understand how the brain encodes and processes information? And when I heard that idea, I was of the belief that it was big enough and important enough for President Obama to be personally involved in. And I knew that there were 3 people within the United States government that I needed to convince: the leadership of NIH, DARPA, and the National Science Foundation. And all 3 of them were excited about the idea. President Obama referred to it in his State of the Union address. He then participated in a rollout of the effort in April of 2013. Congress, when they passed the Cures Act, did something that they almost never do, which is they provided 10 years of funding for the NIH component of the BRAIN initiative. So usually they only provide 1 year of appropriations at a time. And so policy entrepreneurship is the skills that are needed to go from an idea to something actually happening in the world.
Well, it sounds like as a policy entrepreneur, you sort of understood the pieces that needed to come together.
Yeah.
And so you were sort of the weaver of those pieces. And at the time you were serving in an administration, but does a policy entrepreneur, do they necessarily have to be working in government, or can they be someone outside of government as well?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different pieces to this. I think the first thing is having the idea, right? So I wasn't sitting at my desk saying, I want to launch an initiative in neuroscience. I was just saying, I would like to see the United States raise its level of ambition and have a more proactive effort to identify and pursue 21st century moonshots. And the reason that I worked on the BRAIN initiative is that a research community had come together, supported by a number of foundations like the Kavli Foundation. And they identified this opportunity, which is to develop a new set of tools that would transform our understanding of how the brain encodes and processes information. So I think you can definitely have situations where the idea is generated by someone who is outside government. A lot of the things that I worked on, I didn't generate the idea, someone else generated the idea. But then in terms of getting the leadership of some of the major science agencies on board, getting President Obama to include it in the State of the Union address, getting it in the president's budget, having the Congress endorse it, issuing a call to action to encourage not only agencies to participate, but companies, research universities, and foundations. That is very difficult to do on the outside in the absence of having a champion. So I do think that it is important to have entrepreneurial people who are working in the government, who are open to new ideas and have been in government long enough to know how to use the various levers that they have at their disposal to move an idea forward. So the thought experiment that I used to pose to people is to imagine that you had a meeting with the president in the Oval Office. And he says, Brianna, if you give me a good idea related to longevity, then I will call anyone on the planet. It can be a conference call, so there can be more than one person on the line. If that is someone inside the government, like the director of the NIH or the FDA or the CMS, I can direct them to do something because I'm their boss. If it's someone outside the government, I can challenge them to do something. So Brianna, not only do you have to tell me what your idea is, but in order to make your idea happen, who would I call and what would I ask them to do? And the reason that I find that question useful is that things happen in the world when particular individuals and organizations take some action in the pursuit of some goal. So you might think of this as organization A takes action B in the pursuit of goal C. And a lot of times what I had discovered was that people had the feeling that what they worked on was important. But when you ask them, what is it that you want public and private organizations to do that they're not currently doing, they were not able to articulate a good answer to that question. And so they needed to do more homework. But my other reason for asking the question relates to a concept that psychologists have called agency. And it's a particular type of agency. If you work for the President of the United States, you have the ability to send the president a decision memo and have him check the box that says yes. And if that happens enough times, then you develop an increased sense that there are more things in the world that are potentially changeable as opposed to fixed, because they're the result of human action or inaction. So if someone said, I want to change the second law of thermodynamics, there's no way to do that as far as we know. But if you said, hey, I want the National Institute on Aging to do something differently than it's currently doing, there are ways to do that. And so I had this very strong sense that there were more things in the world that are changeable as opposed to being fixed. And I'm always interested in conveying that strong sense of agency that I have to other people so that they can be more concrete as they think about what's the world that we want to create, and what is the coalition of the willing and able that we need to build in order to make that happen.
Yeah, and before we jump to our next question, you make a good point. With my experience on Capitol Hill as well, the members I worked for would have meetings every 15 minutes, and they would have a number of different individuals and organizations come to them with problems, but oftentimes they would just come to them with problems and no solutions and no people to contact. So really what you're saying is you got to sort of give them a template of exactly what to do. Otherwise they have another 15-minute meeting and they forget what happened in the last one. So you've got to give them that APG.
Everyone you talk to says, you're never going to believe it, but it turns out what I work on is incredibly important, right? Everyone says that. No one comes and says, what I work on is actually not that important. But if you say, okay, let's say that I'm prepared to stipulate that for purposes of this meeting, what do you want me to do? And I was shocked at how often people were not able to answer that question.
So now that you're not in government, obviously the experience that you learned there is invaluable and will stay with you, but you're at Schmidt Futures. So tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing there, your role, and what you're doing to advance aging research.
Sure, yeah. I think that One of the most important things that I've done to advance aging research is to give a young scientist a grant under a program that we have called the Schmidt Futures Innovation Fellow Program. This is someone I got to know when I was working for President Obama on the BRAIN Initiative. His name is Adam Marblestone. He studied with a number of the leading researchers like George Church and Ed Boyden, and was at DeepMind at the time. And we gave him an innovation fellow grant because he and one of his colleagues, Sam Rodriguez, had a really interesting idea, which is that there's a class of scientific and technical problems that are really, really important for moving science forward. They're very difficult to do in a startup because there's no short-term path to profitability. So if you were a venture capitalist, you would say, this is too early for me to fund because it's unlikely that there's going to be an IPO or an acquisition on a time frame that is relevant to my fund. And it's also difficult to do in an academic environment because it requires a higher level of team science and systems integration than one can typically do. So we provided him with a one-year fellowship to interview well over 100 scientists and engineers on whether they could be bottlenecks that might be addressed through a novel mechanism for funding and organizing research called a focused research organization. And these are temporary research nonprofit organizations that are philanthropically funded. They might have a 5-year goal that they're trying to achieve, which is very, very specific, and have a budget of on the order of $10 million a year for 5 years. And he identified a number of really strong candidates for focused research organizations. 2 of those FROs are being supported by Schmidt Futures, which is a philanthropic initiative supported by Eric and Wendy Schmidt. But a third one called the Rejuvenome that he worked on with Jose, who's a leading thought leader in the field of geoscience and aging research. The third area was called the Rejuvenome. And that is being supported by Jed McCaleb and involves collaboration with the Buck Institute. So that's probably the biggest impact that I've had so far on the field of aging research, because that exercise of agenda setting led to a $70 million focused research organization in the field of aging, although it was supported by another philanthropist, Jed McCaleb.
Well, and philanthropy, more and more philanthropists are getting involved in aging research, and the private sector has begun to catch on, but sort of the one arm, and it's a critical arm that's missing, is government. And while we have a lot of focus on neurodegenerative diseases, and there's a lot of work committed to helping seniors, the actual biology of aging doesn't get much attention at all. So why do you think there's sort of this disconnect on Capitol Hill? Why don't they quite get it like the private sector and philanthropists do?
Well, I think that this, let me tell you what my hypothesis is, which is that members of Congress, and I think there's, a pretty natural reason for this, are going to hear in the area of biomedical research, primarily from patient groups, because patient groups are organized and vocal, as they should be. And so they're going to hear from someone who has a personal experience with the disease, or a loved one has an experience from the disease. So they might hear from an individual who says, I have cancer, or my wife has Alzheimer's, or my daughter has juvenile diabetes. They don't hear from someone who says, I'm getting older and I want you to do something about it. So I think the question is like, it's it seems to me it's logical that they're going to be hearing primarily from patient groups who are organized or tend to be organized around a disease. So the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, or the American Diabetes Association. I think that's primarily who they're hearing from. In your experience, do members of Congress and their staff have time to read the scientific literature on geoscience?
They definitely do not. Maybe, from the various interest groups that come and visit, maybe they'll read a few bullet points on the pamphlet they give.
Yeah.
But there's definitely no one there who's, even remotely an expert in that area. And you get very few staffers who have a scientific background.
Yeah. So I think for those reasons, they don't have the time or the ability to read the primary scientific literature. And number one, and number two, they're primarily hearing from patient groups who are going to do advocacy around a particular disease. I don't think that they have been briefed adequately on number one, the exciting progress that is being made in the field of geoscience, and what is the case for increasing our investment in this area in ways that would result in increased health span. And so I think this is a really important distinction, because I think most people, if you said, do you want to live longer, if that means that the period of time when you are in significant physical and cognitive decline is also longer, I think most people would not be terribly excited about that as a goal. So I just think, living longer just for the sake of living longer, I'm not sure is the right goal. I think the goal is to live longer, healthier lives, and to have and to delay the onset of the chronic diseases that are associated with aging, so that for as long a fraction of your life as possible, you are independent, you have a high quality of life, and you are mentally and physically fit. And the idea that we could do that by both understanding and intervening in these underlying mechanisms of aging is an idea that I don't think a lot of members of Congress have been briefed by the extent to which leading researchers and now entrepreneurs believe that this is a feasible and desirable goal. So I think this is one of the areas where there is genuinely an information problem. That is, there's some important information that probably needs to be conveyed to members of Congress, but also people in the executive branch as well.
Yes, I think there's certainly an information gap. And I think one thing that I find somewhat comforting is just that, older citizens, senior citizens, are such a strong voting constituency. And one sort of misnomer I think people have about members of Congress is that they don't listen to their constituents, but that has not been my experience. And so if you get for better or for worse sometimes, and so if you get a very strong coalition of individuals who are advocating for something and demanding something, then you can really turn things around. And if you look at the AARP and whatnot, they're very, very powerful. So I think there's just sort of this information gap, yes, with members of Congress and also with the general public. And so once you can kind of educate both parties, hopefully you could see some movement quickly. And that's what we're hoping to do here, is to start building that advocacy coalition. I want to jump back in time a little bit, back to your time in the Obama White House. So one of the core projects you worked on in the Obama White House was the administration's BRAIN initiative. What progress has been made since the launch of that initiative? And do you think a similar model could be used for a grand challenge on aging?
Yeah, so I think that when we launched the initiative, it had the active participation of NIH, DARPA, the National Science Foundation, and then IARPA began to participate as well. When you had the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, there was no one in the White House that was paying attention to the BRAIN Initiative or supporting it. Fortunately, the Congress provided 10 years of support for the BRAIN Initiative in the Cures Act for the NIH component. So the NIH component, continued to make progress. So for example, one of the things that we didn't know about the brain is what are all the different varieties of cells that are in the brain? So we didn't even know that. So like, how are we supposed to understand how the brain works if we don't even have an accurate cell atlas that tells us what are all the different types of cells that are in the brain? We made a lot of progress in the development of these were some DARPA projects in deep brain stimulation technologies that could improve our ability to deal with neuropsychiatric diseases. IARPA had a really successful program in the field of connectomics that has led to some really interesting breakthroughs. So looking at a map of brain circuits as a way of trying to understand how the brain works. So lots of exciting advances. If I could wave a magic wand and make something happen, I'd want to see the Congress support not only the NIH involvement, but the involvement of NSF, DARPA, and IARPA, because I think they brought a different perspective to the BRAIN Initiative. So for example, one of the really exciting areas is the relationship between neuroscience and AI, both what AI can do for neuroscience, but what neuroscience can do for AI. So at current projections, next generation supercomputers would require their own dedicated power plant because they're so power hungry. Do you know how much energy the human brain uses?
I'm not even going to try to guess.
20 watts. So clearly Mother Nature has figured out something about low power computation that electrical engineers and computer scientists don't understand.
Very
And
efficient.
obviously there's a lot of, the way we train machine learning systems is often by giving them millions of examples. And a toddler learns not to touch a hot stove with one episode, so it doesn't require millions of examples before they learn something. So clearly, human brains, there's a lot that we have to learn with respect to low power computing, with respect to the ability to generalize from very small numbers of examples, and the generative nature of human creativity. And that's not an area that the NIH is really focused on. They're not saying like, oh, how can we take what we learn from neuroscience and apply it to AI and machine learning? So that's why I think there's a strong case to have a greater diversity of agencies participating in the BRAIN Initiative in addition to the NIH.
So then what do you think are the possible elements of a national initiative on longevity?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number, and I'm going to just sort of tell you what they are and give you like a sentence or two on each so that we have enough time for Q&A.
Yep.
So I'm not going to give you a 50-minute speech on this.
Fair enough.
But one is fundamental research. So there's still a lot that we don't know about the underlying mechanisms of aging. So I think that would be the first element. The second element would be the discovery and validation of biomarkers. And I think that's particularly important as we think about how the FDA would approve therapies that were designed to delay the onset of multiple chronic diseases. So how do you avoid a situation where a clinical trial would have to take a really, really, really long time to demonstrate that it was effective against aging? And could we have validated biomarkers that were strong enough so that they could be used as so-called surrogate endpoints? So that would be a second area. A third is obviously translational research and clinical trials, helping move these ideas from the bench to the bedside. A fourth would be looking at animal models. So one idea that people have had is give the research community greater access to pre-aged animal models so that they're not just doing research on, for example, very young mice and rats. There might be other animal models in addition to mice and rats that we want to use for aging research. So I think there's a lot to do in the area of animal models. A fifth is workforce. So one of the things that is happening is that companies are beginning to hire away a lot of the leading researchers. We need researchers who are going to stay in universities and prepare the next generation of scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs. We need people who have, for example, expertise not only in geoscience, but know how to design and run clinical trials. So the workforce. A sixth is the development of new platform technologies. So what is the equivalent of high throughput sequencing? You know, the types of technologies that are really important to do measurements that are necessary for geoscience, to be able to understand multiple mechanisms of aging at the same time, as opposed to just studying one at a time. A seventh would be the infrastructure that is needing to support the aging research community. So this might be better information management of all of the data that is being generated by clinical research. So for example, in some fields, we have things like GenBank that are supported by the NIH that make it easier for the research community to access all of the genetic information that is coming through high throughput sequencing. And the last area that I identify is something called regulatory science, which is not something that gets a lot of attention, but I think is really important. We want the FDA to make science-based and evidence-based decisions when they're reviewing a diagnostic, a therapy, a vaccine, or a cure. The question is, what happens if the information that they need in order to make that decision doesn't exist? So the FDA, when Peggy Hamburg was the FDA commissioner, recognized that the FDA had knowledge gaps, that there were things they were being asked to make decisions about some emerging area of biotech, and the information that they needed in order to be able to make those decisions didn't exist. And so they created a program of regulatory science, but it has a very small budget. They've created centers of excellence in regulatory science at places like University of Maryland, Mayo and Yale, Stanford, and UCSF, but that's an area that I also think could get some significant funding. So Dylan, over to you. I think Brianna is dealing with a fire alarm at
Yes.
Where she's currently calling in from.
The old fire alarm. All right. Well, this is a great time to get to the questions and answers. So let's start that. I've gotten a bunch of your questions through the chat, so I'll just kind of pick some at random. The first, Tom, is what are your thoughts on the role of organ-on-a-chip technology or lab-on-a-chip technology in the aging process? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's actually something I worked on during the Obama administration. One of the things is I don't think that there's enough interagency collaboration And so at the time, both Francis Collins was NIH director, Regina Dugan was the DARPA director, and I encouraged them to get together so that NIH could learn more about how DARPA did things, and that DARPA could learn about what were some of the most pressing biomedical research projects that DARPA might be able to support. And what led to that was a big human on a chip project that was called Microphysiological Systems, that involved joint funding from both the NIH and DARPA. And it supported work in areas like organoids and microfluidics as a way of being able to connect multiple organoids into a microphysiological system. And I think this general area of how do we do better than mice in terms of predicting the safety and efficacy of drugs is important, not just for aging, but for lots of different areas as well.
Agreed. Great question, Sam. That was from Sam Brower, by the way. This next one's coming from Keith Powers. What are some examples of potential advanced market commitments that could be effective for longevity incentive prizes?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know about advanced market commitments, I think this is a really important area. So economists who study the economics of innovation distinguish between push and pull approaches. A push approach is where you provide a researcher or a team or a company a grant or a contract, and you're pushing the development of the technology. A pull approach is you try to make it more attractive for the team that accomplishes the goal that you've identified. So an example, a recent example of an advanced market commitment is as part of Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed said to Pfizer, if you get an emergency use authorization, we pre-commit that we will purchase X million doses at Y dollars per dose. And so Pfizer knew that they could begin to invest in manufacturing because they knew that if they developed this vaccine, that the United States government was committed to purchasing it. And so what it requires is that you have a clear goal, right? So these work best. For example, NASA did this with SpaceX. When we retired the space shuttle, we had to pay the Russian government, I believe on average, $58 million per astronaut per ticket to go up to the International Space Station. So NASA was very interested in having a US company that was capable of delivering astronauts to the International Space Station. So NASA said to SpaceX and some other private sector companies, build me a rocket that can deliver and retrieve cargo to the International Space Station and ultimately astronauts. And not only will we buy rides on the rocket, but we will provide you with milestone payments for intermediate progress towards that goal. I also worked on getting DARPA prize authority, which they used for the self-driving car competition. Then when I worked for President Obama, was able to work with the Senate to include prize authority for up to $50 million in the America Competes Reauthorization Act. So I think that the next step for thinking about this would be to say whether the aging community can articulate a clear goal that would be measurable, and that there's also some reason to believe that the private sector would underinvest in it, right? So if it's something that the private sector is going to do, you don't have to have a advanced market commitment for enterprise software or getting people to click on ads or high frequency trading, because those are problems that the private sector is incentivized to solve. So you have to identify a clear measurable goal, and then you have to say, is there some reason to believe that the private sector just won't solve this problem by themselves?
Great. Awesome. Thank you for that, Tom. So there were a few questions actually about ARPA-H, so I'm just going to ask one of them here. Do you think ARPA-H is the right way to pursue a 21st century moonshot in health, or is there a better way than ARPA-H? How do you see ARPA-H playing into this? What's the value of it?
Yeah, so I think that if it's anything like DARPA, I think they have a couple of superpowers. One is they're able to recruit because they only have to recruit on the order of 100 to 120 people. And they have a good brand, and a certain mystique has grown around the organization. As people who work there say, if you don't do something as important as inventing the internet, then you get a B. So there is this culture that allows them to really swing for the fences and pursue high risk, high return ideas. And the advantage of that is that it empowers the research community to pursue ideas that there is not necessarily consensus for. In a more traditional peer review process, if the agency is only able to fund 10% of the proposals that they get, then it just takes one person on the committee to say, well, Dylan claims that he can do X, but he does not present enough preliminary data to show that he will actually be able to do this. And so I think it's really important that the federal government have the ability to support non-consensus ideas. You still have to have a really good filter. Like the program manager has to have the ability to say, because you can have non-consensus ideas that are just crazy, and no one should support them, right? So it requires a lot of judgment and taste to be able to distinguish those non-consensus ideas that are worth betting on, and those that are just crazy and would be a waste of money. So I'm excited about it. I also think that an ARPA-H could play an important role in supporting platform technologies. Again, NIH is organized around diseases and organs of the body, and therefore, I think it is more difficult for them to support these horizontal platform technologies as opposed to supporting research that is directly relevant to a particular disease like cancer or diabetes or Alzheimer's. Why did we have a scientific revolution when we did? It was because optics advanced to the point where we could develop microscopes and telescopes. And I think lots of times scientific advances occur not just because someone has a brilliant new idea, that happens too, but because we have a tool that enables us to measure and manipulate, for example, complex three-dimensional biological systems in a way that we couldn't do before.
Awesome. Great. The next one is coming from Zach Richardson. What type of balance of lobbying efforts should be focused on aiding the private industry, in terms of like tax breaks and things like that, versus public funding for institutions like grants?
Yeah, I think that I see a lot of hand waving when it comes to regulatory issues. So for example, I hear some people say, oh, it just would require that the FDA recognizes aging as an indication, and then all of our problems will be solved. I'm not entirely sure that that's true. And I think what I'm more interested in is coming up with, having people come up with more specific ideas. And so what's an example of this? An example is the concept behind the chain trial, which is that you would use something called a composite endpoint, which is, could you wind up delaying the onset of multiple chronic diseases that are highly correlated with aging? And that's something that the FDA was was receptive to. So I just think that I'm not convinced that just having the FDA say aging is a condition would magically open the floodgates. I could be wrong, but I'm just not convinced. So I think that more specific ideas, like if you're the FDA and someone comes to you and says, you know, I have an anti-aging therapy, how would you evaluate that, right? I think that a really important part of policy entrepreneurship is empathy, is putting yourself in the shoes of the policymaker and really being able to say concretely, what is it that I would do if I were them, given that they have to worry both about innovation, but they also have to worry about safety.
Sure, great question. So this next one's coming from David Wood. So he says in the 1960s, there was little momentum behind research to cure cancer because it was widely seen as a lost cause. Campaigns by the Citizen Committee for Conquest of Cancer drew a lot of attention for members of Congress. So, you know, what do you think A4LI and other longevity advocates out there can learn from that example?
Yeah, so I think that at a high level, I think that a near-term opportunity is to engage the research community and the life sciences companies to brief members of Congress and their staff about what the opportunities are and where the important role for government is. So I talked about some examples, but I think, for example, there's roles for the National Institute on Aging. I think there's a role for the NIH Common Fund, which supports cross-cutting projects. So they've already supported one in cellular senescence. I think that there are roles for the FNIH, which enables public-private partnerships in biomarkers, and they already have a biomarkers consortium. I think that there are roles for the FDA, particularly around regulatory science. So I think that's the near-term opportunity, is to make sure that members of Congress who are in key leadership positions in both authorization and appropriations committees know about the potential, and are hearing from you know, the top researchers in the country and some of the leading entrepreneurs that are pursuing a science-based approach that has real science and rigor behind it. So that's where I would start. You know, I think that if you could get a grassroots effort going, so that, you know, members of Congress are hearing directly from their constituencies, I think that would be great. I think that will take longer. And so I think there's some low-hanging fruit with a strategy that is more inside as opposed to outside.
Sure, absolutely. Great. So this next question is coming from Keith. What do you suggest as ways to help people learn who exactly would be the action targets for a given idea? And as an example, Keith says, who should be asked / challenged to require standardization of physiological biomarker data to be required for any clinical trial? So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess I would try to figure out whether this has already been done in some area, right? So is there a model that can already be pursued? And then I would try to figure out, like, who are the major funders of the data? And could we get a consensus and potentially tie this to the requirement that the NIH is going to begin to require with respect to something called a data management plan. So just to provide a little bit of context, there's growing support for the idea of open science, which is if the federal government funds something, it should be in the public domain. And this started with publications. So for a while, the NIH and now other agencies say, if you get federal funding, then 12 months after publication, your article has to be available to everyone. And so NIH requires submission to PubMed. And now NIH and other agencies are beginning to move in this direction, not only with respect to the publication, but the underlying data that supports the publication. And so that would be one potential way to do that, is to include this into the data management plans.
Great. Okay. So we'll do like 2 or 3 more questions here, and then we'll wrap it up. This one is from Cameron. How do you see longevity as a topic in electoral politics? And what are your thoughts on the process of a pro-longevity candidate running?
I'm not sure that it's going to be a voting issue anytime soon. So Dylan, maybe that can be one of your goals, is to prove me wrong. But I'm not sure that it is going to be, if you asked the Americans what their like top 3 issues are, I'm not sure that it'll be in that top 3 in the near term future. But I think the good news is that it's not necessary for something to be the subject of electoral politics for something to move forward. So I can tell you that there were no voters who were contacting me in the late 1990s saying, Tom, I really want you to launch an initiative on nanotechnology. There were no voters who were asking President Obama to say, please launch a brain initiative. So I think that, what's required is to have a compelling idea, to be able to explain not only the what, but the how, at different levels of detail, depending on who you're talking to, and to be able to identify capable champions in both the executive branch and the Congress to move these ideas forward.
Great. Okay, so we'll do one more and see how much more time we have. So how should the private sector support government initiatives on aging? Do you see opportunities for partnership?
Oh, absolutely. So for example, when I worked on the Brain Initiative, we did a call to action, and we had a number of instances in which industry stepped forward and said, here are some concrete things that we can do to support this. So then National Photonics Initiative got involved, a company called Inscopics, so that they would provide, that they would partner with researchers to support the Brain Initiative. Google helped with the data management and storage associated with some of these large-scale connectomics initiatives. So absolutely, there's important roles. And I think it's also important for the private sector to say, what are the things that will lift all boats? What are things that will support the industry as a whole? And how can we work together to create what economists call public goods? Those things that are beneficial to industry and society as a whole, but which any one individual firm is going to underinvest in. So rather than just not doing anything about it, call attention to it and have a plan for how government and industry and academia and civil society can work together to create these public goods.
Awesome. All right, great. So this will be the last question we do, and then we'll wrap it up. How much would politicians' enthusiasm for funding geoscience be boosted if leading mainstream aging researchers were to, publicly assign a time frame for estimates and achievement? So, X numbers of years for, Y outcome. This helped in the case of cancer 50 years ago. So what are your thoughts there? Do you think that would help?
Yeah, I think it is a little bit of a double-edged sword. You can have a situation in which the research community over-promises and under-delivers. But for example, when I was working on the National Nanotechnology Initiative, what I asked the researchers is, what are things where, what's an example of an ambitious but achievable goal that you think might be possible if we increased investment in nanoscale science and engineering? And they told me things that were totally incomprehensible. We could develop a material with a Young's modulus of this many gigapascals, functionalized nano-engineered MRI contrast agents, and the ability to develop molecular electronics with a storage density of 10 to the 15 bits per cubic centimeter. And I turned that into store the Library of Congress in a device the size of a sugar cube, make materials that are stronger than steel in a fraction of the weight, and detect cancerous tumors before they're visible to the human eye. And those were the examples that President Clinton used when he rolled out the National Nanotechnology Initiative in January 2000 in a speech he gave in Caltech. So the ability to have a compelling and understandable story about the future, I think that's useful. I think there is always risks. You see this with the history of AI. Going back to the original Dartmouth conference, they said, oh, we're going to have AI by the end of the summer. And so, never mistake a clear view for a short distance.
Awesome. So there are a ton of other questions, but we're about to run over time here. So let's wrap it up now. Thank you everybody. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Brianna, for your time today. This was really a productive conversation. It will be posted on YouTube. So if you missed anything, if you hopped in late, please go to our YouTube and it'll be up there. If you support what we're trying to do here, make longevity a political focus of politicians, visit A4LI.org and get involved with what we're doing today. Yeah, that's it, everybody. Thank you for your time, and hope to see you next time.
And Dylan, are you going to capture the questions that we didn't have time to answer?
Absolutely, I have them captured right here. There's a lot of them, Tom. So you might have your work cut out for you after this. But let's wrap up, and I will see all of you hopefully next month.